This is the Telescopic World Season 2 Chapter 9. In this episode, we will be talking about the implications of the telescopic effect. Now, in many past episodes we have talked about how the telescopic effect manifests as a consequence of the telescopic nature of this reality. We have talked about how every object in your life effectively impacts global events, due to its representation as a symbolic object of something higher in the life of another. In effect, it is as if we are all playing with global events in the manner by which we live our lives. One of the implications of this fact, first and foremost, is that to truly live your life according to your duties and responsibilities, engaged with your life, is indeed godly, because if you manage your own corner of the world, the higher will reflect that judiciousness. But a deeper implication relates to the manner by which the architecture of this reality is structured generally. In the Glitch Panopticon, we talked about how there are spiritual machines, very much like biological machines, operating in interdimensional spaces. The idea was that these apparitions prune our thoughts, very much like biological machines prune our DNA. These spiritual machines are an indication that beyond interdimensional spaces, beyond the consensus reality, is a kind of spiritual organism. A cell, if you like, which organizes and structures the interdimensional spaces beyond our conscious perception, for most of us. In other words, what I am proposing with this podcast is that the consensus reality that we appear to inhabit is outside a cell. Not a cell made of biological components, but a cell, comprised of another substance. And there is more to the story. The interdimensional spaces beyond our conscious perception possess an intrinsic architecture. This architecture is comprised of a kind of spiritual matter, components beyond biological or material matter, which as material beings we can hardly grasp. But the most important implication of this idea is that we are outside the cell. The cell is beyond the consensus reality, but more accurately, it surrounds it, penetrates it, interacts with it, without being subject to it. It possesses sovereignty. But it is also acting with a plan, an agenda, a direction. It prunes our thought processes. It directs our moods and our history. It eliminates certain negativity and fosters other directions to our thought processes. Now, in the early episodes of the Panopticon, we suggested that these interdimensional apparitions were a function of the agenda. A function of the controllers, aliens, who manage the Panopticon. But what if this was an error? What if the cell, as I call it now, beyond the interdimensional barrier which separates our bodies from our spirits, is actually just another way of thinking about God? I mean, first there was geocentrism, then came heliocentrism, then came a more accurate picture. Initially we assumed that we were the center of the universe. But as time passed, we came to accept that we were but a small part. Perhaps all this time we have assumed that we exist in the only universe, which exists, when in fact, we exist outside a living breathing spiritual organism. An organism with spiritual machines, operating just beyond our perceptions, working on our spiritual components, as biological machines edit DNA. Further, have you ever looked at a map of the universe? Doesn't it look a lot like connective material surrounding a cell? What if this universe is a kind of substrate, a kind of suspension, for the cell we call God? Now, the other idea I want to get across relates to the architecture beyond the interdimensional barrier. I have discussed multiplicity in the podcast How to Create a Glitch in the Matrix monologues, found on Podbean. I have discussed multiplicity as a concept to explain the reactive emotionality which manifests from the intersection of those who have escaped integration. But I am starting to see that if the telescopic effect is accurate, which I believe it is, then the multiplicity which results from not fully engaging with one's life, not doing one's duty, is a manifestation of consciousness scattering through our universe, or spatial space, from one spiritual space to another. Let me explain what I mean by that. If everything we do, to the extent we satisfy our duty, represents an organizational efficiency in the telescopic world as a whole, then it is easy to see that the scattering of consciousness might result from a breaking of the mold, the pattern to which we have been selected to fulfill. In effect, the telescopic nature of reality betrays the centrality of an individual's struggle with their own objects of consciousness in the larger trends of humanity as a whole. More precisely, since we see that multiplicity reveals 9 distinct plates, 9 distinct classes of parallel universes, we can see that there is indeed architecture within the interdimensional spaces which surround the material. Effectively, what I am saying is that, perhaps multiplicity is merely the bridge between two arrays, a spoke separating two wheels. Consciousness scatters, revealing the telescopic nature of reality, because it is a breach in the interdimensional barrier separating us from the architecture of the cell, God. I imagine that this architecture, or rather, within interdimensional spaces, there is indeed 9 spokes, of a single wheel, separated by a single axle, which is multiplicity. In effect, if God is the cell, what is living, beyond the interdimensional barrier, then knowing of the architecture of multiplicity tells us a lot about the design of this reality, but also a little bit about God, too. Anyway, the key point of all this is that we assume our universe is central. I am suggesting it is not merely not central, but is rather a residue in interstitial space. A kind of connective structure surrounding the spiritual cell, which is God. It may be that understanding the telescopic nature of reality says a bit about the design of this universe, but it says more about what reality looks like beyond multiplicity. A world where internal causes govern, rather than external causes. It may be that the telescopic effect is a perversion of the natural order of things. A reductive association between redundant internal components. It may be that the telescopic effect is an attempt to cut God out of causality. That's the end of the podcast for today. If you enjoyed it, please like, comment and subscribe.